I want to begin with an offer that was refused. In the early 1740s, a Philadelphia printer named Benjamin Franklin designed a new kind of fireplace. This stove that used a hollow baffle to circulate warm air heated a room far more effectively than anything colonists had used before. The governor of Pennsylvania was so impressed that he offered Franklin a patent, an exclusive right to manufacture and sell the stove. Ben Franklin said no. Now, he explained his reasoning in his autobiography. To paraphrase our founding father, since we benefit so much from the inventions of others, we ought to be glad to share our inventions freely and generously. Now, this was not naive idealism. Ben Franklin was already a very wealthy man. He'd made his fortune through the Pennsylvania Gazette newspaper and Poor Richard's Almanac, an annual book that contained the calendar, weather forecasts, science and math facts, and various proverbs, including famous ones like "Lost time is never found again," and "Early to bed, early to rise, makes man healthy, wealthy, and wise." He could afford to be generous, but his refusal to patent was more than personal charity. It was a statement about the kind of society that he was trying to build. The Franklin stove was democratic technology, affordable, reproducible, freely shared. That was the point. And the stove is just one of a remarkable catalog of inventions. Franklin also gave us the lightning rod, for which Immanuel Kant called him the Prometheus of modern times. Franklin invented swim fins when he was just 11 years old. He gave us bifocal glasses. He published a map of the Gulf Stream. He created a musical instrument, the glass harmonica, for which Mozart and Beethoven composed music. It had glass bowls of various thicknesses and sizes mounted on a spindle that could be turned by a foot pedal. By moistening your fingers with water, a player could produce up to 10 notes or chords at a time. Of all my inventions, Franklin said, the glass harmonica has given me the greatest personal satisfaction. But Franklin refused to patent any of it. Here's why that's important. Ben Franklin didn't see his scientific work and his political work as separate pursuits. He was simultaneously inventing better stoves and helping to invent a republic. He signed the Declaration of Independence, essentially starting the Revolutionary War, the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War, and the U.S. Constitution. He founded the American Philosophical Society, which he modeled on Britain's Royal Society. He founded the first successful lending library in America, the first public hospital, the first fire department in Philadelphia, and even the Ivy League University of Pennsylvania to train future leaders in business, government, and public service. For Franklin, science and civic life and self-governance were all part of the same project. This was not incidental to the founding. The generation that wrote the Constitution were immersed in a world of scientific thinking. Harvard historian I. Bernard Cohen traces the founders' engagement with science, including the works of John Adams, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson. Now, we should be cautious about overinterpreting the use of scientific language in political rhetoric. Alexander Hamilton, writing of replacing accident and force with reflection and choice in Federalist I, or the fundamental concepts of separation and balance of powers in our governmental structure, certainly contain echoes of scientific thinking, but they're still more Montesquieuian political philosophy than Newtonian natural science. But even so, the founding era was immersed in innovation, political and scientific. Monticello, the historic home of the lead author of the Declaration of Independence, is replete with engineering marvels that I can remember visiting as a child. The dumbwaiter to transport wine bottles from floor to floor, a swivel chair with a writing arm, and a 2-pen copying machine called a polygraph. I actually tried to recreate one of those at home when I was a kid. While Jefferson didn't invent all of these himself, he delighted in technological advancements big and small, including his self-made gadgets that he called gimcracks. And that connection between American innovation and the American experiment in self-government continues even today. Because from its founding, America has been a technological experiment as well as a political one. And the question that every generation of Americans have faced is the same one that Franklin faced when he chose to turn down the patent. How do we ensure that our innovations serve the common good? So let's jump forward about 100 years to the middle of the 19th century, because this is where the story grows very wide. By the mid-1800s, the United States faced a problem. The country stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We were a continental nation. And frankly, there was no historical precedent for a republic across such a vast geographic expanse. You see, republics were typically cities or small states, not nations the size of the continental US. And American leaders were genuinely worried that citizens on the far side of the continent would feel so remote from the eastern region that they'd simply form their own country. Self-governance within a single nation at this scale was almost unthinkable and seemed impossible. The distances were just too vast. But two technologies helped change that, and both tell us something important about the American relationship with innovation. The first is the telegraph. Samuel Morse and his collaborators developed the electromagnetic telegraph through the 1830s and 1840s. And in 1861, in the midst of the Civil War, the first transcontinental telegraph line was completed. 27,000 poles, 2,000 miles of wire stretching from coast to coast. Now think about what that meant. For the first time in human history, a message could travel from California to Washington, from one end of the continent, nearly instantly, rather than taking weeks. It took longer for people to manually translate the dots and dashes of the Morse code into written letters than it took for the signal to go from coast to coast. The Pony Express, which up until that point had been the fastest overland communication system, with young, strong riders galloping between relay stations, handing off mailbags at full speed, became obsolete literally overnight. It shut down 2 days after the telegraph was completed. Historian Thomas Jepson called the telegraph the grandfather of all our modern communication technologies. And Tom Standage referred to the telegraph as the Victorian Internet. And I think they're right. The telegraph was the first technology that allowed instant communication across vast distances, and it fundamentally changed how government, businesses, and the press operated. If you or your students have a hard time imagining life before the internet, ask them to imagine life before the telegraph, where every piece of information traveled only as fast as the person, horse, or ship that carried it. The second technology was the Transcontinental Railroad. In May of 1869, at Promontory Summit in Utah, the railroad that crossed the country was completed with a very publicity-friendly event. They picked out and used a golden spike to mark the joining of the railroad. Now, as part of the festivities, they wrapped telegraph wires around a ceremonial hammer and a ceremonial spike. So when the hammer dropped and struck the spike, symbolizing the completion of the railroad, the impact was transmitted cross-country via the telegraph. Now, subsequent reporting revealed that, not unlike this afternoon, there were a few technical difficulties, including officials actually missing the spike on their first swing. But nevertheless, these great technologies of nation building, the telegraph and the railroad, were joined in a single ceremonial moment. You see, the railroad didn't just move goods. By 1880s, the railroad industry was the nation's largest employer outside of agriculture. 17,000 freight locomotives, over 22,000 passenger locomotives. It created an integrated national market, practically the size of Europe, but without all the internal barriers, without tariffs between states. There could be a common language and a unified financial system. And these rails carried more than just freight. They carried ideas. They carried newspapers, books, letters. They helped cultivate a national identity and culture that simply would not have been possible without these technologies. Remember, though, as with all transformative technologies, they came with trade-offs. You see, the telegraph and railroad solved the problem of scale. They made self-governance across a continent actually possible. But they also created new challenges. The railroad concentrated enormous economic power in the hands of a few companies. And so Americans had to develop new institutions and processes to deal with that. The Interstate Commerce Commission and new forms of regulation and new legal frameworks. Even today, the time zones that we have across the continental United States were the result of the railroad system. You see, keeping consistent time is important for planning train schedules, and there wasn't a standardized approach to time. At one point, there were over 300 local time zones across the country. It could be two very different times in places really close to each other, and yet the same time in places vastly far apart. So as a result of the railroad, we adopted 4 standard time zones across the continental US, each an hour apart. This process was started by the railroad companies themselves and was eventually signed into law in the Standard Time Act in 1918. But by the way, that law that standardized time zones came 35 years after the railroads established the practice. Do you see the pattern? A transformational technology arrives, it disrupts and creates new possibilities for democratic life, but it also creates new challenges. So Americans adopt practices and institutions to harness the benefits while addressing the problems. There's a famous book by Richard Weaver called Ideas Have Consequences, and they do indeed. But we should also remember that technologies have consequences as well. Technological innovation followed by institutional adaptation. That's the rhythm that we see in history. In the midst of the dramatic transformational advancements like the telegraph and railroad, there was another revolution happening alongside that was no less significant. If you visit Colonial Williamsburg, you can watch blacksmiths labor diligently using the same handcrafting approach that marked the founding area. Careful, methodical, manual labor to create useful tools. It is hard work, especially in the heat of the summer. And it is impressively artistic. But in the late 18th century, Thomas Jefferson visited a French gunsmith named Honoré Blanc, who was experimenting with something radical, manufacturing musket parts that were interchangeable. See, instead of having a single skilled craftsman build each musket from beginning to end, hand-fitting every component as he went along, Blanc was making parts so precisely uniform that you could take a lock from one musket and drop it into another. Jefferson, not surprisingly, was fascinated by this and wrote home immediately. But see, in France, governments and businesses resisted Blanc's method, because after all, this approach represented a profound change to the status quo. Gunsmiths feared that it would eliminate their custom repair services and put them out of work. Leaders believed that by dividing the building process up would disrupt the harmony associated with effective collaboration. But in America, the idea took root. The principle of interchangeable parts is one of those innovations that doesn't really sound exciting until you realize what it made possible. If every part is identical, you don't need a master craftsman to build a product or repair it. Everyday workers can assemble goods. Ordinary citizens can fix them. You don't have to have a special bloodline or status or position or gender to benefit from this. Production can scale. prices fall, and products that were once luxuries can become affordable. British observers came to study the American factories in the mid-1800s and gave the approach its name, the American System of Manufacture. Based on interchangeable parts, it transformed clockmaking, sewing machines, typewriters, and eventually, of course, automobiles. The assembly line simply wouldn't have been possible without interchangeable parts. Most famously associated with Henry Ford in the early 1900s, his assembly line used a conveyor system with a series of discrete sequential steps that paired human labor with standardized parts to mass produce automobiles. As a result, Ford's moving assembly line reduced the build time from 12 hours per car to just over 90 minutes. This was, in its own way, yet another form of democratic technology. It put manufactured goods within the reach of many. And this is a moment worth lingering on. The American system of manufacturing is an example of how technological innovation can carry values, in our case, democratic ones, with implications to the benefit of society. When you reduce the dependence on selected master craftsmen, you open the door for larger numbers of people to participate in the production. When you make repair possible without custom fitting and expertise, you empower citizens to maintain the very things that they own. When you bring down prices, you make products accessible to people who could never have afforded them before. This is technology in service of equality, not because everybody planned it that way, but just because that's what happens when you combine American ingenuity and American ideals. And this brings us to the 1958 essay from Leonard Read called I, Pencil. If you've never read it before, the premise is charming. A pencil narrates its own creation. And the pencil's point, no pun intended, is that no single person on Earth knows how to make even this simple object. In the essay, he recounts how the cedar comes from Oregon, the graphite from Sri Lanka, the rubber from Southeast Asia. The meadow farrow requires mining and refining, and thousands of people across dozens of countries coordinate to produce something that you could buy for a few cents. Now, while the details have changed over time, the core premise remains. Even though there was no pencil monarch or central pencil committee, pencils got made, and at such a scale that they became ubiquitous. The coordination happened through numerous millions of individual decisions guided by prices and incentives, producing an outcome more useful and more affordable than could ever occur through central planning. It's a simple yet profound example of the power of markets to both coordinate and serve people in a counterintuitive way. Because while individual aspects of the process are largely distributed and uncoordinated, it almost feels isolated or possibly even selfish. The final product reflects this unseen collaboration involving countless people in a collaboration that is at a scale beyond what most of us experience on any given day. And this also connects directly to our theme. Each era of American innovation develops new forms of coordination, new ways for free people to work together to produce things that no individual could produce alone. So now we come to the 20th century, and two developments that are really one single story about America's capacity to reinvent how it does innovation. The first is Bell Labs. Founded in 1925 as the research wing of the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, which is the telephone monopoly, nicknamed Ma Bell. Bell Labs became, by most accounts, the most productive laboratory for new ideas in the world. And the list of what came out of that single institution is staggering. The transistor, the laser, solar cells, fiber optics, the Unix operating system, the C programming language, the concept of cellular telephony, even the discovery of cosmic microwave background radiation, echoes of the Big Bang itself. 9 Nobel Prizes, all from one lab. The transistor alone, invented in 1947 by 3 physicists at Bell Labs, has a fair claim to being the most important invention of the 20th century. It replaced vacuum tubes with something smaller, cheaper, and more reliable, and is the fundamental building block of every computer, every smartphone, every piece of digital technology you have ever touched. So what made Bell Labs work? John Gertner, in his book The Idea Factory, identified several key ingredients. Technologically brilliant people in close physical proximity. Management that understood the science of what they were doing. Long time horizons. Projects that could take 10, 15 years. And as he said, crucially, stable sources of funding. You see, homes were wired for telephone, and every American's phone bill had a little tiny surcharge that funded this basic research program. Nobody at Bell Labs had to worry about writing grant proposals or justifying quarterly results for their efforts. They could think about problems that wouldn't yield solutions for years. It was, in a sense, a public investment in the future, even though it flowed through a private company. But the second story grows directly out of the first. In 1956, William Shockley, one of those transistor co-inventors, left Bell Labs and moved to Palo Alto, California, to be near his aging mother. There, he founded Shockley's Semiconductor Laboratory and recruited a team of brilliant young scientists. Turns out, though, Shockley was, well, how do you put it kindly, a very difficult manager. Within a year, 8 of his best researchers, thereafter coined the Traitorous Eight, resigned together and founded their competitive company, Fairchild Semiconductor. Fairchild was the incubator for what we now call Silicon Valley. 2 of those Traitorous Eight went on to found Intel. 1 co-founded the venture capital firm Kleiner Perkins. By one count, Fairchild's descendants included over 400 companies worth more than $2 trillion. Silicon Valley represented a fundamentally different model of innovation. Bell Labs was a factory of ideas, centralized, monopoly-funded, patient. Silicon Valley was a geography of ideas, or a marketplace or bazaar of ideas, distributed, venture-funded, fast-moving. Silicon Valley didn't have a single powerful machine the way that Bell Labs was designed, but many interlocking small ones, grouped close enough together to be equally, if not even more powerful than what Bell Labs could do. So when the conditions that made Bell Labs possible, when those conditions changed, Americans didn't stop innovating. We just created a new way to innovate. That capacity for reinvention is one of America's most important and least appreciated strengths. See, the specific models and technologies change over time, but what endures is the commitment to organizing human ingenuity in service of something larger. So where does that leave us today? We are all aware that we are living through the emergence of another transformational technology, artificial intelligence. Specifically, generative artificial intelligence with agentic AI capabilities. Now, I'm not going to try to convince you that this is the most important technological innovation in American history. Americans have heard that claim before about the telegraph, about electricity, about the internet. Now, to be fair, AI might actually be more important than all of them. Well, at least until the next revolutionary technology comes along. Instead, what I want to do is place AI within the story that we've been telling. Think about what each of the technologies we've discussed actually did. The telegraph transformed how information moved. The railroad transformed how people and goods moved. Interchangeable parts transformed how things were made. And the transistor transformed how we compute. Each one took something that was scarce in society and it made it abundant. Each one was overwhelming in its moment, and each one seemed to change the entire world. And in every case, Americans rose to meet that challenge. Not by resisting the technology, and not by embracing it uncritically, but by doing the hard work of adapting our institutions, our laws, and our civic habits to harness innovation for good. AI is the latest chapter in the story. It's not the last chapter. There will be others. But it is our chapter right now. The potential for AI is immense. We have democratized access not only to information and knowledge, but to reasoning, analysis, even creativity. To borrow a phrase from the founder of Anthropic, we now have the equivalent of a country of geniuses in a data center, available to virtually everyone via their computer and smartphone. Someday, people will look back and marvel how the world ever operated before artificial intelligence. But right now, for those of us going through the transition, particularly in education, it can be disorienting. And frankly, it can be frightening. People are worried about jobs. Not just adults, kids. And they're not wrong. The disruption is real. Now, there is a lot of all or nothing thinking in this space. Either AI replaces this class of jobs or it doesn't. But we know jobs aren't just one thing. They're a bundle of tasks, dozens, maybe hundreds of discrete activities that add up to a role. Well, if that sounds a little familiar, you'll recall the similar reaction in the past. Because for many, the idea of replacing a skilled craftsperson with distributed labor and interchangeable parts was unthinkable, or at least unwelcome. And yet, we live in a world shaped by the American system of manufacturing. For most of us, we're not growing all of our own food, making all of our own clothes, fashioning all of our own tools. We're the beneficiaries of these technological innovations and process changes that have gone before. But for most of us, it's invisible because all that stuff was there when we were born. Here's an innovation that we're seeing happening and changing the world right before us. That is harder because we're living through the change, but it is no less revolutionary than the transformational changes that have happened in the past. So as we look at the present and toward the future, can we imagine a world where organizations consist of humans and AI agents working in collaboration with one another to build great things? That's not even so much future, it's actually happening now. What about a world filled with autonomous vehicles that transform how we travel? Also, not so much future now, although not equally distributed across the whole country. What about a world where those AI-powered autonomous vehicles become more than just cars? Maybe they become mobile batteries storing and transporting power from renewable sources to areas of need, basically completely overhauling and changing our whole electrical grid. And that's even before we start resuming human space exploration. And we're just at the beginning of this transformation. We are truly early in the AI age, so buckle up. We face many challenges, but there are real reasons for confidence. We have a tradition of harnessing technology for democratic purposes that stretches back to Franklin himself. We have demonstrated, generation after generation, the institutional and cultural capacity to adapt. And we have a civic environment that has historically understood innovation and self-governance as part of the same project. For those of us who are educators, this history can be empowering material that we bring to our classrooms, because the story of American technology shouldn't be seen as a story of things happening to passive people. It's a story of people making changes to harness these technologies and serve the world. Franklin chose to give away his stove. Americans chose to stretch telegraph wires across the continent. Bell Labs chose to invest in research that might not pay off for years. And out of those choices came a nation that went from a handful of colonies hugging the Atlantic coast to the most innovative civilization in human history. We here have benefited profoundly from those choices. In reminding one another, our colleagues, and our students of this inheritance, and challenging ourselves to live up to the best of this tradition is no less important today than it was in the founding. From Ben Franklin inventing a new stove and a new republic, to the myriad citizens connecting a continental nation through telegraph and railroad, science shaped the American regime. From Bell Labs, where America demonstrated that it could concentrate expertise and produce extraordinary public goods, to Silicon Valley, where America distributed and reinvented the innovation model itself. We adapted our practices when situations changed. In each case, the technology was new. The institutional response was new. But the animating question was always the same. How do we harness innovation to serve liberty and improve lives? So let's close where we began, picturing Benjamin Franklin standing in his Philadelphia workshop, rejecting a patent offer. What links Franklin's inventions to those of present-day Silicon Valley isn't just ingenuity. It's the conviction that technological innovation can be used to promote liberty, strengthen self-government, and improve lives. From the lightning rod to the light bulb, telegraph to the smartphone, and now the emergence of generative artificial intelligence and AI agents, science and innovation has been central to the development of the United States. This is our traditions as Americans, and it remains our challenge for tomorrow. Thank you.